Hello and welcome back to Ignite&Scale. I'm your host, Mike Allen from Cambria Private Capital, and I'm excited to continue our journey through Season 2. We've been diving into some incredible innovation, growth and resilience topics. Today, we're tackling a more important topic than ever, cybersecurity, particularly in the automotive industry. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, William Taaffe, Chief Operating Officer at Lockdown Cybersecurity. William and his team at Lockdown are doing crucial work providing specialised security solutions to finance professionals and businesses, particularly in the automotive space. They've also recently released a critical white paper on the CDK ransomware attack and its widespread impact on the automotive industry. More details on how to reach William and learn more about Lockdown Security will be in the show notes. William, welcome to Ignite&Scale. To kick things off, maybe you can share a bit about your background and what led you to your current role at Lockdown Cybersecurity.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me, first of all. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast this morning. It's a good question. What led me into cybersecurity? Well, I've been working professionally within cyber for over 10 years now, so it's flown by, to be honest with you, Mike. It's a very dynamic industry and there's a lot of change, and every single year there's a different challenge that we have to face, whether it's adversary threat or whether it's compliance regulatory changes. And because of the nature of cybersecurity and the type of role that I work, we work internationally. And that's really interesting and fun for me. I always loved the people element of cybersecurity, of meeting different businesses and different types of operations in different cultures and understanding how they differ from the UK market. And I find a lot of fun within that element of cybersecurity, as well as different challenges by territory, which can be led by a huge variety of different factors which influence that. But to answer your question, I suppose when I was still in school, I was introduced to cybersecurity tools and cybercrime tools and malware, which wasn't called malware back then. They hadn't coined that term yet. So we were still very much in the phase of calling everything viruses. And even things that weren't viruses were coined as viruses as well. And during that phase, I think I got to learn about, well, you know, to take it back further than that, when I was a kid, about 11 years old, I got my first computer, and by about 13, I was harrowing my parents by taking it apart. And I can remember my stepdad's face where he came in and saw all these screws on the carpet, and the computer completely pulled apart, and all of the chips and everything removed from it, and the motherboard removed, and panicked that this £2,000 piece of equipment that he'd not long bought had suddenly been pulled apart. But I was always quite curious with the internal workings of it, and you know how it came together and how it worked. And I always kind of thought, looking at a computer, that you could compare it to the human body in many ways. You know, that was my first view of a computer, was that really the monitor was the eyes, and the motherboard was the brain, and the hard drive was the heart, and I saw it like that. And so I think I got curious from quite a young age about how they worked and what functions they did, and excited about the possibilities. And the internet was a brand new thing, and not many people had access to it back then. So you were in quite an exclusive club with it. And I was just completely drawn in like a moth to the flame, really, Mike. And then when I got probably kind of, you know, mid-teens, about 15 years old, we were entering just before the 2000 bug. Do you remember the millennium bug?
Y2K.
Yeah, and that was an interesting time, Mike. Was that something when you were working in the industry that people were really concerned about? Do you remember the conversation?
I think there was an initial concern in the lead up to New Year's Eve, wasn't there, that none of the computers will work in the new millennium. So from my non-technical perspective, I just remember there being a little bit of concern whether it would impact the ability for businesses to transact, and what would this new millennium look like? But first of January, the computers seemed to work and everyone forgot about it. So that was my non-technical take on it.
Yeah, it was the primary concern was that when the clocks turned over and it became the new year, that because of how the computerized systems were built, it would throw everything into a state of flux, and aeroplanes would fall from the air and ATMs would spew out cash. And unfortunately, I never found any of those ATMs, but during those years, kind of pre-2000, you could do a lot in terms of manipulating computerized systems, and there were certainly instances of hacking that were going on back then, but they just looked very different from where we are today. And the joke I often like to tell, as part of our training, is to pull up the film Hackers from 1996, which is an Angelina Jolie movie. Did you see it? No, it's average. It's not great, but it kind of brought to the fore, I suppose, to the public attention this concept of hacking. That there were a group of individuals out there who had grown up with computerized systems, who could understand how to manipulate them and what you could pull from them. And the theme of the film, when you look at the marketing for it and the posters that were produced, stated on the top, their only crime was curiosity. And this was 30 years ago, Mike. And I like to joke that today their crime is extortion. So you can see how the world has shifted in terms of cybercrime and how that has developed as its own thing. And I think that's quite poignant, because hacking pre-2000s was almost seen as something that you would do to potentially steal information. It was still a crime. It was a crime that was prosecuted under the Computer Misuse Act of 1990. But the difference with it was that it wasn't monetized in a way of trying to extort businesses or individuals. It was really about seeing if we could find information about aliens or who really shot JFK. And these burning public questions that no one knew the answers to, but we believed governments were hiding. And that's what hacking was, until it kind of shifted into this huge money-making industry, which you see today, which I think a lot of people haven't fully appreciated the scale and the volume and size of that marketplace and how active and prominent it is in today's society.
And William, I mean, clearly you've done a lot of work providing bespoke solutions to the automotive sector. Why is cybersecurity such a critical issue for the automotive industry today? I know we've seen some high-profile cases, and there's been obviously other cases that people don't report. But why is it so prevalent to the automotive industry in your view?
Well, I'll kind of flip it on you if I can, Mike, because you've been in an industry, you've been in the industry for a while now, and you've seen changes through the years in terms of how processes work and how an operation functions. So, going back, I suppose, let's go back to kind of the end of the 90s, or head back into the 90s. With computerized processes within the automotive sector, especially within motor retail, have you seen a big change and shift in how businesses operate in a digital function?
Well, huge, yeah. I mean, clearly it's complex, isn't it? And there's no one system in an automotive dealership. There's the system architecture can be very different, and your average dealer group might have 25, 30, sometimes more systems to connect with the OEMs, to connect with the customer, to ensure a better customer journey. And it's a complex operation, isn't it? You're working alongside manufacturers to give consumers the best journey you can. And obviously what you're delivering is complex as well in terms of delivery of cars and servicing and finance, etc. So the system architecture reflects the complexity of the service offered to customers.
So this is a perfect answer, Mike, and it was exactly what I was hoping for. So we'll unpick it a little bit, right? So the first thing to say from everything that you've just said, and considering as well how behaviors in the world have changed. And what I mean by that is our buying behaviors. Because I imagine, not that I was old enough in the 90s or early 2000s to have it. Well, actually, I probably was old enough, but I lived in London, so I had a bus pass, Mike, and that was how I travelled before I left London. But in 2006, Facebook launched. And social media suddenly became this huge thing. Before that, there was social media, there was MySpace, and there was Face Party, and there were some, early adopters, I suppose, that came. But that's when it came to the fore. And within that, what you suddenly had was a more educated customer. You had people that would go on the internet, that would research cars, that would understand what they were looking for and understand the spec and the details before they arrived often at the dealership group. So in many ways, I don't think the nature of sales has changed, but I think the nature of buying has changed, right? And that's what's led everything and changed the way. And within all of that, what you have is an enormous quantity of data. So, I mean, even where you are at the moment, and thinking about the size of data sets that you use today compared to a year ago, compared to 5 years ago, I'm sure you've seen an explosion in the availability of data that you can use within your business, Mike. And customer databases have become bigger and wider, and they've become more bespoke, and we try to understand our customer profiles, and we try to understand the demographics, and we use analytical tools, and innovation has really accelerated in a dramatic way, led by faster internet speeds and led by better technologies and cloud technologies creating flexibility. But essentially, what drives all of those systems is data. And so what we've seen an explosion of data. And the interesting thing about data is that from a criminal perspective, we know that criminals are after data because they see a value in it. But within your own experience of high-level senior leadership management, Mike, and understanding finances as well as you do we ever value data on a balance sheet?
Not in the conventional way, no. Obviously there's lots of intangible value to it, but that's hard to put a number on. So yeah, that's a more difficult thing to quantify.
So that is a really interesting theme for me, mate, because the criminals, they do put a number on that, which I find really interesting, right? Given the disparity between your statement, which I would say is the widely held view, versus the criminal view of it when they're trading data for selling it for profit. So that's one aspect of it. And then you said, 25 to 30 systems. Well, that's that essentially means
I'm
you've
not
got 20.
joking.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm not exaggerating.
and it's probably north of that though
It
sometimes, right,
probably
Mike?
is. It can
Yeah.
be. Can be.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of businesses that we go into that still have software that's running in their systems that they didn't even know they were still using, right? The amount of cloud systems that we look at where contractors have come into work for an organization and their access has never been rescinded, which means that if somebody was to gain access via that account, they would then have access to all of that data and information held within those systems. So I think managing an infrastructure and estate, it's very easy to buy things when we're excited, right? And innovation is brilliant, and it tells us how we can streamline our business, how it can become more profitable. The motor industry has always been concerned with the margins and how to create additional revenue streams, how to earn better margins and build a more profitable business, right? As is every business, to be fair, but specifically for motor, that has always been the challenge. And I think the way that businesses have looked to get over that is by embracing innovation, by streamlining processes, by creating a better customer experience. And we see that even today with AI and the fascination with artificial intelligence, where businesses are looking at how they can leverage that to expand their customer base, to expand their sales portfolios. But within every one of these innovations and systems, what we also incur is a level of risk. And if a business is flying blind by bringing in systems over years with different members of staff who all have different motivations, all bringing in different systems and different suppliers and creating more complex supply chains, essentially what we're going to be left with is an environment with a number of potential holes. And in cybersecurity, the saying goes that you're only as strong as your weakest link. And if there's one single link in that chain that is broken, and it doesn't have to be broken through a technical threat or an exploitable vulnerability, but all too often it's actually exploited through misconfigurations. So, to kind of put that into focus a little bit, both Volkswagen in 2021 and Nissan in 2020 suffered reasonably large data breaches that were embarrassing and led to fines for both organizations. Both of those came from misconfigured systems that they'd added within their processes that were misconfigured, and the data was available publicly. And that's one of the concerns with cloud, because we've moved away from physical servers because of cost and because of scalability. But the downside is that if you haven't understood if everything is configured correctly, and if you're not testing those configurations to ensure it, you're potentially leaving yourself with a hole that can be exploited.
I know you recently published a white paper on the CDK ransomware attack as well, and that massively impacted the US automotive world in particular. But for our listeners who may not be familiar with it, maybe you could explain what happened during the CDK attack and why you think it was so significant. And we'll put the white paper link into the show notes as well, because I certainly learned stuff from your analysis there as well.
Well, that's very kind, Mike. And, please, if anyone would like a copy of that, be delighted to send that across. And hopefully it will provide some really good learnings, as well as a bit of a demystification of what happened without it being Wuthering Heights length and causing people to switch off. Well, I think the answer to that lies in the fact that one of the biggest threats in cybersecurity in 2024 is actually the threat that originates from a supply chain. And that's not just secluded to the motor industry. That's actually really widespread. So even this year, if we think of the NHS and the cyber incident which impacted the NHS service, that actually came from the supply chain. And the problem with the supply chain is that all too often, especially when it comes to digital processes, our supply chain is critical to the ability to function. And I think this was something that was really, really felt by the businesses who were impacted by the CDK incident. And I think the first thing that they were aware of was something that they probably were already aware of beforehand, which is how vital the DMS system is to a motor car dealer. Within your views of the groups that you do, has that always been seen as pivotal to the operation function, Mike?
Yeah, no, it is, and I think I saw anecdotes from the CDK data breach where people couldn't sell cars, or if they did sell cars, they were writing it down on kind of pieces of paper almost, because it is very critical to. It's complicated, isn't it? Because you've got to wait for a car to arrive. You go through all the logistical challenges. The car's got to be there for the customer. It's got to be prepped. It's there's a lot of moving parts to the car buying process. And when you've got a critical bit of software that informs you on that, and that's no longer being able to use, then it can halt the operations, which is what we saw in the US.
Do you think many of those businesses in the US had planned for a scenario where the DMS was not going to be viable? You couldn't use access. Do businesses plan for events like that within the management and board meetings and senior leadership?
There's always people always look at risk assessments, etc. But I guess until it happens, you don't know how severe it's going to be, do you? And it obviously caught a lot of dealers by surprise. But to be fair, they bounced back quickly as well. But it was obviously traumatic at the time.
Yeah, and I think this is a view, right, that we have to challenge. So the first view is it won't happen to me, right? And we know that we can look at statistics of cybercrime, and we can look at those stats, and we can see that the government actually released a report last year on the breach survey, which is DCIT, the Department for Science and Technology, Science, Innovation and Technology. What they actually stated was that 4 out of 10 of all businesses in the UK were impacted by a cyber incident. That's a really interesting statistic, because when I was with an event a couple of weeks ago where the police were giving a talk, they stated that only 2% of cybercrime actually goes reported. So what the true number is and the true figure of that is something for debate, but it's going to be far higher than what we're seeing in the news and what we read in articles.
Clearly, the threats of cyber are growing. It's hit the automotive industry, both sides of the pond. Maybe you can share a little bit more about what you do specifically to help automotive businesses fortify their defenses. What are you kind of doing now to kind of help dealers with this?
Yeah, so I mean, if you take the CDK incident, that was a critical piece of software where the manufacturer of the software suffered an incident. That incident then had an impact and causality across the whole supply chain that used that product. So I think from a risk assessment perspective, we have to understand how we operate and what contingencies we would have in place to protect against that. And I think the first stage of any good cybersecurity program is always the cheapest phase, and that is upskilling staff. Can you look around your boardroom and say that you have somebody there that has a background or knowledge within cybersecurity that can advise? And that could be part of your main board, or that could be a non-executive director. But are you bringing in that level of intelligence to your organization? I think going forward, probably looking at America, where this is becoming a requirement, we're going to have to do this as part of our compliance requirements, to have somebody on a board with that level of experience that can advise. So I think that's the first stage, is training, right? Can we upskill our management? Because we know that a good cybersecurity initiative comes from tone from the top. It's crucially important. And it's really important that people feel that they're able to communicate effectively, that they're able to understand what this means. And so in order to do that, we have to remove the technical language in the industry, and we have to be able to relate it to business language and business processes that can universally connect people in. The second part of that is that our staff are essentially our frontline. So we need to make sure that our staff recognize the risks, that they're aware of the red flags, that we understand how we report, and we know what the process is to do that. And so upskilling staff and training of staff is crucially important. It's something that's often overlooked, even though compliance does mandate it in different ways. And you only fall foul of that when you have an incident and they ask you to demonstrate evidence of reporting of training. And that's where that comes. But I would always say that is your start point, that's your foundation pillar. But then what I think you need to do is that you need to have a risk assessment across your business to understand your maturity as a business. And one of the things that we used to do traditionally, Mike, was we would look inside the building to the end of the windows. We would look and build our environment, and then we would look at the windows and make sure they were locked. And actually, the view is changing, that because of how attackers operate, the really interesting view is to see the view from the outside in rather than the inside out. So by doing assessments of organizations, we can be able to see what's connected in terms of internet-facing assets, what could be exploited, where vulnerabilities might lie, and how that could allow an attacker to get into our systems and essentially go after our crown jewels. And I think in order to understand how to protect our crown jewels, what we first need to do is identify what those are for our business. So the first step is almost as simplistic and it's a common sense step. Let's understand our environment. Let's understand all of our systems. Let's understand how our processes work. Let's understand where vulnerabilities may be inside. Let's understand our processes and how we're going to deal with certain things. For example, a member of staff leaves. What do we have in terms of how we rescind access? And what do our processes look like to ensure that we're not incurring risk into the business during that process? So I think there's a whole piece here around understanding our exposure and our maturity as a business and what we're trying to do and which gaps we're trying to enclose and what improvements can be made. But with an admission, Mike, that what we're not wanting to do is just spend millions and millions and millions on this problem. Rather, we're trying to box cleverly, right? We're trying to spend money in a way that is effective at reducing the risk without incurring financial risk to us in the same way. So I think what's really good is to understand your start point of where you are as a business in terms of your maturity. And then the rest is really about having robust business continuity plans. And the thing with robust business continuity plans is that they're not really robust until you've simulated them, Mike. So I think really what it is it's about building a plan, and it's about simulating it. It's about understanding your environment and where those risks might come from. It's about training the board, understanding the importance of cybersecurity, understanding the financial risk we may be incurring if we don't. And then it's about training staff to recognize those risks, as ultimately our staff are our frontline. They're our culture, and everything good from a good cybersecurity strategy comes from everyone being aligned.
It feels like a very holistic service, really, in that you're kind of working with all stakeholders to ensure businesses are as safe and as robust as they can be, and then if they still come under attack, you can obviously help in that time of trauma as well, and clearly maybe there's some post-mortem work that can be done, because I guess one of the issues is the automotive industry is just rapidly evolving. We've got new technology, electric vehicles, autonomous driving is coming, connected cars is coming. I mean, clearly that's going to present more problems within the cybersecurity world, because cars are going to be increasingly data machines, really, and carrying more and more data. So perhaps that probably sounds more risky from a cybersecurity perspective going forward.
It's a huge challenge, Mike, I think, for the manufacturers. And I did a quick run through before this call. Just in the last 4 years, noticeable attacks, and this is just a handful, but Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Volkswagen, Hyundai, and Kawasaki were all impacted, and the impact of those cyber incidents was a lack of production ability. So they couldn't actually produce. So at the moment, when we look at the threats, especially to the manufacturer sector, the threat is that, it destabilizes the whole production line, that we have to rebuild the architecture, that we lose crucial days, that we can't ship vehicles, that we can't fulfill contracts. And there's a knock-on impact throughout the whole industry that happens. But when we start thinking about, the technologies that you just said about autonomous vehicles, well, from a policing perspective, especially over the last 10 years, when we've seen increasing threats from terrorism, where terrorists have thought, well, I can commandeer a vehicle and I can use that as a weapon. Well, an unmanned vehicle, potentially that's autonomous, poses a far greater risk from a terrorist perspective, in that way. So I think evolving threats will always be there, and as a threat evolves, there will be a technology to try to combat that in many ways. And I think as part of the whole environment, from the user and the car driver through to policing and law enforcement, through to the manufacturers, through to the motor dealers, we all have a role within guiding how that looks to make sure that we do it in a safe and effective way.
That's really insightful, William. And maybe before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your thoughts on one final topic. What is the one piece of advice you give automotive businesses and their leaders when navigating these complexities? Only one piece of advice, though.
Yeah, I would say don't be fearful, right? And I think we're often fearful of things that we don't understand fully. And because of that, sometimes there's a tendency to do a bit of an ostrich and bury your head in the sand about the problem, and for a variety of reasons believe that it's not going to impact us. I think the start point is education, right? We have to educate everybody, because that's the most crucial step in understanding how we're operating and where those risks occur. So my first bit would be, don't be afraid of this. It's scary, yes, when we read about it in the news, right? But it's not overcomable. That we can actually deal with this in a really pragmatic way without spending an enormous amount of money to do so. But we can only do that if we're educated to understand what the risks are and where they're coming from.
That's great. William, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show today. I think our listeners will walk away with a much deeper understanding of the cybersecurity challenges and how they can protect their businesses. And for those listening, if you want to learn more about lockdown cybersecurity or read the full white paper on the CDK ransomware attack, please do check out our show notes for links and contact information. But thanks again, William, and thanks again to our listeners for tuning in to another episode.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you.
If you want to listen to more episodes of the podcast, we're on all good audio platforms. Our website is also www.cambriaprivatecapital.com, and you can also find myself on LinkedIn and Twitter, where we publish our weekly blogs as well. Please do get in touch if you want more information.